Thank you to Rob, Melanie, and Svetlana for organizing it and for inviting me to chair this session. And I'd like to start with our keynote speaker for this session, Dale Tronrud. He majored in molecular biology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, followed by a PhD at the University of Oregon in Brian Matthews' lab, where over many years he developed a number of novel methods incorporated in the TNT refinement package. More recent work at the Oregon State University in Andrew Karpla's lab has focused on the comprehensive ideal geometry library. In this keynote, he will review the key developments of the 1970s protein crystallography methods, focusing on the fast Fourier transform and reciprocal space stereochemically restrained refinement. Dale, please.
All right, hopefully my screen is live. Good afternoon. It's good morning for people on my side of the world. So I'm a little groggy at this hour of the day, but hopefully I'll stay awake through this talk. I started thinking about this and got to thinking about Fourier transforms, but that was because I realized that next year is the 50th anniversary of Lintonic introducing the fast Fourier transform into crystallography, which was really a watershed moment. Using a fast Fourier transform made so many things possible that weren't possible before. And to this day, the fast Fourier transform is what makes things fast enough that we can really do the many techniques that we're using. And that got me to thinking more about the 1970s in general. I was not actively involved. I was in high school through a lot of this time, but it really was a special period in the history of crystallography. But Lintonic, go on here. So in the 1970s, it was a very different world. If you remember, or I remember the talks that Helen Berman was doing at last year on the 50th anniversary of the Protein Data Bank, 1972, there were 7 protein structures that had been solved, and she and other people were trying to figure out how can we preserve, how can we disseminate, how can we share these 7 structures. A lot of other people were looking at saying, wow, it is possible to solve structures. We really want to do this. We want to do a lot more of this. And so at that time in the 70s, there was a great explosion in universities hiring people with the intention of them doing protein crystallography and solving many more structures. It would start to produce a great demand for work being done in this area. The 70s was also a special time in that integrated circuits had just been developed a few years before, and the technology for miniaturizing circuitry and making these integrated circuits do more and more things was beginning its rapid growth that continues to this day. So computer capacity was suddenly exploding. The power of computers was getting faster and faster at a tremendous rate, and the price was going down, so that individual labs or maybe individual departments would buy computers that these crystallographers they were hiring would use. The 70s also was the period when the first computer graphics displays started to come on the market, and people were really getting serious about the idea that maybe we could use these computer graphics displays in our model building and generating interpretations of our data without building physical brass models held together by screws. And so people started thinking of how to put these together. And there wasn't really a great organization. There wasn't somebody saying this should be done. CCP4 hadn't even been conceived of yet. It's just people who are interested in these sorts of things picked up the tools and started down the road. So I'm going to talk about several areas of development that really blossomed in the 1970s, that there was a tremendous amount of implementation of code and the first one is the area closest to me, since I ended up working in this area later, is the least squares optimization of models. This is refinement. Refinement was the big thing that hadn't been done before on X-ray structures. The 7 structures that have been solved were built as physical models, and then the atoms in those models were localized in space and typed into computers, but they were not optimized in any way. The second topic is geometry idealization, of saying that we've got to be able to make sure that the bond lengths and bond angles of these models are acceptable. And then there's model rebuilding techniques. How can we take these models and improve them and make them better in the bigger changes that can't be handled by these optimization programs that were being developed? And I'll mention a little bit about the idea of phase refinement. Of course, all the structures being solved at that time were being solved through experimental phasing methods, because if you have 7 structures in the protein data bank, molecular replacement isn't really high on your list of techniques for solving structures. So MIR phasing was a big thing, and NCS averaging, non-crystallographic symmetry averaging, was just being recognized as a useful and powerful tool. Before this point, non-crystallographic symmetry was considered more of an annoyance, and you tried to find crystals that didn't have any non-crystallographic symmetry to make your life simpler. It was only in the 70s it was realized, hey, that can be useful. We can take that and run with it. So computers were fairly different back in those days. In the early 70s, you had these big boxes full of circuit boards. This is a PDP 1135. There were a lot of PDP computers that were quite popular amongst labs, that they were of prices that you could afford. They were only like tens of thousands of dollars to buy one of these computers. Now, this is the computer from the lab in the University of Wisconsin that I was working at as an undergraduate for a short time. Ethan Merritt has put this on the web because he was from Sundar Lingram's lab as well. And if this computer had more than a couple kilobytes of RAM, I would be surprised. But that's the sort of level. A lot of the techniques, were limited by how much memory the computer had. The speed was another thing. Speed is always good, but if you wait long enough, you can get your answer. But if you haven't got enough memory to put the problem into your computer, you're not getting anywhere. In the late 70s, the VAX 11780 was put on the market, and this computer became the workhorse of crystallography. Most everybody used VAXs in the late or in the 1980s. It was an incredible computer. This is the computer from Brian Matthews' lab shortly before it was retired. This is almost 2 meters tall and 2.5 meters wide. And this computer, for most of the time we were using it, had 1 megabyte of memory, 1 megabyte of RAM. And we were sharing that amongst 15 people. So memory was always a big problem in programming development. Now, I don't really know how to graphically represent programs. So I'm just using the abstracts from the papers to describe these things. But the first real effort was in 1971. Bob Diamond created a program that would refine a model, but only by varying the torsion angles. He constrained the bond lengths and bond angles and just refined the torsion angles to optimize the structure to the electron density map. It was a real space refinement program. I've never used this program. It actually wasn't used very long because it was found that if you don't allow the bond angles to vary, you can't really fit a protein model into electron density. Constrained bond angles just doesn't work. And that's work that I ended up in Andy Karplas's lab just recently, working on quantifying how much main chain bond angles do vary and whether you can predict it. So this program was stumbled on the fact of this variability that we still struggle to understand. But the solution people picked was just to allow these angles to vary, and then we had restraints to sort of suggest that they be particular values. Right? The real refinement began, and this was the turning point for the decade, was in 1973. Lyle Jensen's lab completed the first refinement of a protein structure. This is rubidoxin with a D-space cutoff of 1.5 angstroms. And this really showed that not only can you refine a structure, but there's important things you can learn by refining a structure. And that was really in doubt before somebody could actually sit down and look at a structure and do it. Brian Matthews tells me he was at the seminar where Lyle Jensen first described the completion of this refinement. And at the end of the talk, he had a picture of a tyrosine ring where the electron density had a hole through the center. And nobody had seen that in a protein structure before. And they got a standing ovation for that. So this really improved the demand for refinement. As it says in this abstract, they got their structure down to 12.6% R factor, which is pretty good even for today, even though you're not considering R freeze. Johann Deisenhofer and Wolfgang Steigemann also did a refinement on BPTI about this time, but these groups were using small molecule methods. There's lots of hand calculations, lots of work with paper difference maps and measuring things on paper difference maps, lots of hand things. So the software really wasn't there. It was really a massive project to do a refinement by these techniques. But what was learned is, since you have to allow geometry to vary, we needed procedures, or they needed procedures, to idealize the geometry and take a model and make the bond lengths and bond angles more like what you see in small molecule structures. And I have two representative papers down here. These are 1976. So it's several years after that, but people like Eleanor Dodson and Lintonic and Neil Isaacs were working on the idea, how do you take a model and do a geometry idealization? There was quite a number of different approaches of this back in that time, but it was all separated out into different parts. The whole idea of a refinement program hadn't come into being yet. And by the mid-70s, the late 70s, these programs started coming out. So 1976 was the publication of ProLSQ, the program by Conrad and Hendrickson. And this put together in one package a program that did reciprocal space refinement. It restrained to geometry, and you put your model in, you ran it, it gave you an answer. It took you a long time to give you an answer, but it wasn't you sitting down doing individual calculations, figuring out first I do this, then I do that. It was a particular program to do that. And all these programs are out, coming out at the same sort of time. Corals came out in 1977, EREF came out in 1978, and FFT-REF came out also in 1978. So just 3 to 5 years after the first structure was refined, people had come up with programs that could do the work of this refinement without all that manual intervention. Now, what's interesting about this is the variety of these programs. ProLSQ is sort of what we think of today as a refinement program. Corals was aimed more for nucleic acids, and it used that parts of the structure don't have to be refined. If you have a side chain of a base, it's this big planar ring, there isn't much reason to vary the bond lengths and bond angles inside of that group, particularly a low resolution. You can do that as a constrained group, and other areas you can restrain the torsion angles. Other areas you can relax the bond length and bond angle constraints. It had incredible amounts of flexibility that we really don't see in our programs today anymore. EREF was the first program to use empirical energy potential and to say we need to have a minimum energy structure as well as one that fits the data. Was collaborative work between Tony Jack and Michael Levitt. And FFT-REF was a British production. Agarwal was at the IBM Center, but it focused mainly on using these FFTs to optimize the calculations. Agarwal developed a brilliant convolution method to be able to use FFTs to calculate the derivatives as well as the electron density maps and structure factors. And I think everybody uses that technique now in their calculations. Now, model building is the other problem that was going on at the time. That's a harder problem because the hardware didn't exist nearly as well. But at the start, most of the models were built using physical models in a Richards box. This is a device that has a half-silvered mirror. You have electron density sections here where you can pull out a particular slab of density that you're working on, and you're building a model on this side of the mirror. And this is a picture I took of the one in Brian Matthews' lab, where you're looking through the mirror at the reflection of the model that appears to be superimposed on the electron density on the far side. So you're working here, looking through this mirror at how your electron density fits that model that you were building. And of course, it was backwards over there. And so that tended to make life a little confusing. We also tend to forget that we worked a lot with paper maps. This is a paper map that I used when I was on my PhD project in the 1980s. We still had paper maps. And there are things that have been lost through time. One of the things is with a paper map, you can show multiple contour levels. So here I can see immediately this is a 4 contour level peak. You superimpose on the atoms. You flip through the pages to get the different sections and find your context. Another technique that we seem to have lost over the years is the ability to annotate maps. So I could make notes on this map. And so when I come back to the map, I could see what I was thinking about when I went to that. And I still know of no way in programs that I can say, here's this blob I don't understand, and I can make notes about it and have that displayed to me while I'm on the graphic system. So we lose things along the way when we go into the future with programs. Now, the graphic systems were incredibly primitive compared to what we have today. These are pictures that Ethan Merritt has on his website about his time when he was in Madison in Sundral Ingram's lab, and I worked some on this vector general system. So he had this computer running it. I picked up this other picture on the internet just showing a random person working on some other thing than molecular graphics, but just to show what the display looked like. You basically had this big display, could only draw lines, and everybody has a keyboard. Keyboards are always there. This one used a light pen to point at things. A thing that we also don't do much anymore is everybody was big on knobs back in those days. You wanted to have dials that you could turn to do things. And so they have a box of knobs. There's a box of buttons you could push to do specific commands. What the knobs do, of course, and what the buttons do is under program control. So we have a much more varied human interface collection of tools when model building in the 1970s than anybody has today. Today we get a mouse and a keyboard, and that's pretty much all anybody works with. This is another computer graphic system. There was incredible diversity between these systems in terms of what the hardware was and how you actually programmed them. So transferring programs from one computer system to another was very difficult. This is the MMSX. It was a government project in the US to actually design and build computer graphics workstations for macromolecular structure determination. And Brian managed to get number 15. There was only 15 of these ever made. And there were 2 racks of electronics to run all this thing. But it's still kind of like Coot when you look at it. There's still a terminal window with black and white text and keyboard you can type on to see the boring stuff go by, and a display over on the side where the incredibly impressive picture was displayed that you could rotate around in 3 dimensions. One of the things the MMSX had was this beautiful control pad. So I always liked joysticks better than mice anyway for rotating, and the MMSX had 2 of them. That meant you could rotate the display and see the 3 dimensions on the screen. At the same time, you could be rotating an object, docking it into that model and not have to switch back and forth. Right now, if you're doing a mouse, you've got to stop moving the screen, move the object, then move the screen to see the 3 dimensions, then move the object. 2 joysticks are great things. And of course, you got to have knobs and switches and things. So instead of Control Shift plus to do something, you can just flip the switch that changes from one side to another. And then you have a little more room for labels on things. Now, the diversity of computer graphic system made programming quite difficult in these areas, because when you bought a computer system, a computer graphic system, you didn't get any software to do anything. People like Ethan had to write their own. So different labs were writing their own graphics software. If you had someone you knew who had the same model, you could get their software from them. People universally shared software back in the 70s. There wasn't a concept of paying money for software. That idea hadn't been invented yet. So everybody was happy to share their software, but you had to figure out how to get the software to run on your computer. For the Fortran programs doing strict computation, that was annoying, but it could be done by most people figuring out how to get a program to run on their system. But computer graphics, you had to have a specialist who really understood it. Alwyn Jones actually came out to Oregon and adapted Frodo for this system, and we used Frodo on it. And he was good enough at adapting his software to many different hardware systems that most of the software in the end, by 1980, was running his Frodo program. And this is a little shot of Frodo here. I probably don't have time to go into that. I've lost all track of my time here, but MIR phasing.
You have about 10 minutes.
With questions or without questions?
Leaving time for questions.
No, 10 minutes that has questions in it?
Yes.
Yeah, so, okay. Yeah, so I'm about where I thought I was. So MIR phasing, I don't know a whole lot about this. This was all taken care of before I was there, but you look at the references for these programs. There were a fair number of programs for doing MIR phasing, and you see a lot of names that are familiar. Gerard Becoin, Wayne Hendrickson, George Reiki, he's not so well known today, Michael Rossman, Steve Sheriff, Lintonic, Keith Wattenpaw, and these are the same people who were writing a lot of the other software programs. So people weren't so specialized into a particular area. People were writing crystallographic software in broad areas, generating these tools that they then distributed elsewhere. Of course, there was no internet. The way you distributed things in the earliest days is you mailed around boxes of punched cards, which was really quite annoying. Eventually, you got into sending magnetic tapes. So there was a lot of magnetic tapes being mailed around the world back in these days. Actually, you could buy small magnetic tapes that were just for mailing, and you could store maybe you could store a program that has 3,000 lines of code on that tape. Doesn't even bother to talk about it in terms of megabytes. It's not even enough megabytes to worry about. And it's a particular focus on this paper. I think a lot more people should read this paper by Gerard Becoin, where he introduced techniques in his software for doing non-crystal. Prior to this time, people were attempting to understand and implement and non-crystallographic symmetry phasing in reciprocal space, on the relationships in reciprocal space, because that's the most direct thing. People were working with lists of structure factors, but Gerard showed that it was much easier to FFT that information using Lin's FFT programs into real space, average the map density together, and then Fourier transform back into phases and amplitudes to get those improved averaged phases. And what's good about this paper is there's a lot of detail about the problems you have when doing computations on maps. And it's trickier than most people recognize when working with maps, because maps are sampled on a grid, a regular spaced array of sampled points. And that's completely artifactual. Maps really should be continuous functions. And so when you sample the maps on a grid, this has consequences mathematically for whenever you perform a computation on that group. And Gerard's paper really lays out in detail, in this application at least, the consequences of that and how to avoid those problems. And there's also a lot in there that's sort of historically fallen by the wayside of how to fit these maps into memory. That's not so much interesting anymore. We have so much memory now. Putting maps into memory is not the problem it used to be. NCS, that was your #1 problem. You had to work with a map, but you could never have the entire map in RAM at the same time. You could only bring in little pieces of the map and work on it. It made life very complicated, and we just don't have to worry about that stuff anymore, which is a great thing. So it comes back, these things. Lintonic in his paper 1977 for calculating structure factors from atomic models also discusses considerably this problem of what happens when you're sampling on a map. And that's why he was able to calculate maps from structure factors in 1973, but it took 4 more years before he could write the paper on how to calculate structure factors from atomic models because of this issue of sampling on a grid and the numeric problems that puts in. And anybody who's working with maps, I think, should read and follow through those problems, because I think a lot of computer programs, even to this day, do not take into account the problems of sampling. So in the 1970s, we had this incredible explosion of software, and I'm looking at this as the analogy to the Cambrian explosion, because the same sort of thing happened in biology when multicellular life forms with the sorts of bodies that we're familiar with today suddenly appeared, and a huge variety, an explosion of diversity occurred. But at that time, there were lots of forms and lots of shapes that don't survive to today. They were weeded out quite quickly. And those ideas may actually have been useful. So in biology, you have this winning problem, but unfortunately, we also had this whinnying in our methods. We used to have many programs for doing refinement. Now we're down to a handful of them, and they're actually fairly similar in how they approach things and how they think about things. We don't have programs like Corals that are commonly in use at the moment that allow for alternate interpretations of the parameterization of the space. We just don't have that diversity anymore of ideas. Certainly the programs work spectacularly well. They're wonderful programs. I use them myself, but there are lots of tools that we did actually have at one time in the past, and those tools have just, they weren't used by everybody, and so it was just deemed not worth the time to move them on.
Dale, sorry, we're kind of running out of time.
This is my last slide.
Oh, perfect. So that means, thank you very much. That was really interesting, and thank you for that sort of walk through the past. I think it's generated a lot of comments already on Slack of people reminiscing about what they found when they first started and how things have evolved. There is a question on the Q&A from Mark Sanderson asking, were you using the IBM 360 or the CDC 7600 or the CDC 6600 as well as in-house PDP 11s? Which I have to admit, I don't really understand the question, but I'm sure you do.
Most of these computers were, the IBMs and the CDCs were department or university level computers. So your entire campus would buy an IBM 360, and then you would be able to use it. Crystallographers were usually given in the middle of the night. They could run their jobs because they'd have to reconfigure the entire computer that is the one computer on campus to focus all of the memory on one particular program. And so it'd be like the middle of a night on a Sunday morning, they would allow you to run your job. And then you'd have to wait till next week before you have another shot where they would take the entire campus down and focus that computer on your particular task. So people were happy to have a smaller computer that was slower than the IBM 360, but if you had it in your lab, you could run it 7 days a week and it would focus on your problems. The CDCs were also big, massive, very powerful computers, very expensive. They were campus-wide stuff. And that was actually part of the, I think part of the problem Michael Rossman had is that Michael Rossman in Purdue had access to the CDC computer. He was able to do incredible computations, but the software was not portable to anywhere else. So the code that he wrote, he couldn't distribute to other people because nobody else could make sense of what the CDC specialized code was. And he also couldn't use software that was being produced elsewhere. So he was kind of an island there in Purdue. He had this great computer that could do wonderful things. So in-house, the PDP-11s were used for controlling your diffractometer, for controlling your instruments and processing data. And you could use it as a controller on the graphic system. The PDP-11s really were never powerful enough to do much refinement. The VAX is where you really had enough power in a computer that maybe a department or in Brian Matthews' lab, it was a grant from the founder of Textronics to the University of Oregon got him this computer. He was very fortunate to get that money early in his career for that computer. And we could then use that. So most of my experience has been with Digital Equipment Corporation, which was very popular in the late 70s and the 80s in crystallography. Everybody used DEC computers for most of their computation in those days.
Thank you very much, Dale. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on. I mean, there's a lot of live comments on Slack about the different software and the different hardware to controlling your views. One thing that I would point out is you said you can't use multi-level electron density maps, and apparently you can in TOOT. There is an option to do that, to look at multi-levels. So thank you, Paul, for that. But just a note to everyone, if you haven't seen it on Slack, there's an explanation of how to make that work. So we're